period we're going to start discussing today, kind of just collectively the Middle English period, roughly 1100 to 1500. If you want to give more specific dates, you could say from 1066, which is the beginning of the change of the Old English period, to 1485, which you're going to see, we'll talk about down here with the Battle of Bosworth Field. Generally 1100 to 1500 works though. So 1066, Norman Conquest, we've discussed that already. Won't say anything else about it other than one of the results of the Norman Conquest, which we alluded to before, was William comes from where? What part? Normandy. He comes from Normandy, France. Okay? Takes him about 20 years to consolidate his power, to put down the native Old English or Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, to begin the process of building castles. And the castles are for the specific reason to house troops to put down uprisings of the restless natives, so to speak. But one of the things that happens as a result is French comes in. First, Norman French. Later on, Parisian French will come into England. In the period from roughly, okay, you could start with, I think, 1066, to roughly 1350 is the period where French has dominance. French as a language has dominance throughout England. It is the language of culture, high culture if you want. It is the language of law. It is the language of court. Court meaning the government. It is the language of the courts, so to speak. It's the language of education. Okay? In other words, for a period of roughly 300 years, right, English is the, what do you want to call it? If it's not the dominant language, what is it? Substandard? It's the language of the lower class. I mean, French becomes the language of everybody high status, right? English is those down below. For roughly 300 years. So during that roughly 300-year period, or let's, 1135, in the entry in the Peterborough Chronicle of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, there are 5 major collections of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This is the one at Peterborough Cathedral. In the entry for 1135, or the entry for 1135, is the first one that is in the history of the English language. When I teach the history of the English language course, we go into more detail about this. It's the first one that is datable Middle English, the Middle English language, as opposed to Old English or Anglo-Saxon. And the reason we can say that is because there is a heavy use or reliance on prepositions and articles. Old English does not use many prepositions. It uses articles, but it doesn't rely on them. Why? Because the inflectional endings on words carry all that grammatical meaning. Okay? One of the things that happens, partially because of the Norman Conquest, is the declining emphasis on inflections rapidly increases. And what I mean by that is, by 1000 AD, okay, so you're still Anglo-Saxon history, Anglo-Saxon period. By 1000 AD, the language had been changing. Why? The way I even put that, it's a misnomer. All languages change all the time. Always. If they're living languages, they change. Now, some languages aren't living languages. They're not meant to be living languages. Sanskrit, as an example. Sanskrit was a holy language, never meant to change. Okay? English, not that way. And so it changes. And one of the things that happened, was already happening, was inflectional endings were changing, were dropping off. Just like today, if you say, I'm running to the store. Run in, I said. I had grade school teachers, I don't know about you did, who would literally, I'm of the period, would rap you on the knuckles if you dropped that final G. Okay. Ted, pronounce that, yes ma'am, whatever. Okay? Why do we drop that final G? Because what comes at the end of the word usually isn't important. It's what comes at the beginning of the word is what's important. All right? We could go into that, but we're not going to. So, it's already happening. What happens with French introduction is it speeds that process up. Okay? And another big change, a whole bunch of words are brought into the English language over that 300-year period. Roughly during the period from 1100 to 1400, over 10,000 words are brought in from French to English. Okay? Over 75% of those words we still use today. So why do you bring a word in to a language? What might be one reason? Or create a word.
You don't have one?
You don't have it. Okay, that's one reason. Another one is, how many of you have gone to a foreign country that's a non-English speaking country, and you've tried to speak in that country's language? What do you often tend to do? Okay, possibly mispronounced, but say you're talking with someone. Say you have enough of that language, conversational. And you're talking on along, and then you want to say something, and you can't remember what the word is in that language. You hesitate? Louder? You say it in your language. You use your word. Okay? Same thing began to happen. Okay? So you have a French word brought in for which there was a perfectly good English word. And in many of those instances, the perfectly good English word died out. Became totally replaced by the French word.
What's an example of that?
I'm trying to think of one.
Oh.
That's my brain is not working this morning.
Derriere?
Louder?
Maybe derriere?
Derriere. I think that's later. That's brought in a lot later then. Well, here's one where the English word isn't replaced. The French differentiated between what was out in the field and what you put on a plate. The Anglo-Saxons didn't. If the cow was out on the field, when you killed the cow and slaughtered the cow, you put cow on your plate. Not anymore, right? What do we call that? Steak, possibly. That's a particular cut. Beef. Beef. Beef comes from French. Cow, good old native Old English. Pig, good old native Old English. Versus pork. Okay? Colors. Native Old English, this is one of the things I love about them. They're just kind of down-to-earth, simple folk. You got your blue. You got your purple. You got your red, your orange, your yellow, your green. It's from French, for example, that we get, in the English language, more names for various colors of red. Give me two other colors. Pink's not really red. Scarlet. Maroon's a little mixture of red and brown. Burgundy, not one I'd thought of before. Scarlet, vermilion, crimson, all French. Okay, all those come from French. So you get this introduction of these words and a loss of Old English words. You have coming along with that, a loss of the Old English native ability for creating words, which gets revived during the Elizabethan period. The native Old English facility for creating words was you take this word here, and you take this word here, and you jam them together. As an example, Old English Hilda, battle. Old English loud, light, battle light. It's a kenning for sword play. But two words, just jam them together. Okay? They stopped doing that during the Middle English period. Why? Because you bring in French words. That Old English facility gets revived in the Elizabethan period, primarily because of, I shouldn't say that, it's not primarily, well, it kind of is. Largely because of Shakespeare. Shakespeare has been called the greatest neologist in the English language. Neologist, new words. He created over 1,700 of the words that he uses. Okay? More than anybody else in the English language. It's like he needs a word, he can't think of it in English, and he just creates one out of out of Greek or Latin. Shakespeare, for example, the first writer to ever use the word exists. Like what? How could you not have the word exist before Shakespeare? To be or not to be is to exist or not to exist, okay? Anyways, so you get this domination by French. And I mean real domination. So if you want to, quote unquote, succeed in society, if you want to, become important, what must you do? Speak French. So you have to learn French. So you have to be taught French, okay? But not if you're up at the top of society. If you're up at the top of society, French is your native language for roughly 300 years. So what do you have to do in order to communicate with the peons down below you? You're going to have to learn at least some rudiments of the peons' language. English. Like to speak to your serfs, to speak to your servants. So you have French speakers slowly, very slowly at the beginning, learning some English. So they're learning some English, and when they can't think of an English word, they bring in a French word. And when the English can't think of a French word, they bring in an English word. But they're not bringing in, it's their native language. Okay? This goes on for about 200 years until 1300 or so. And sometime, we don't know why, we can't give an exact date, but sometime right around 1300, a shift occurs. And what we start to see are the people at the top of society are now learning French as a second language. In other words, English has already won. They've already adopted English as the native language, okay? And there are historical reasons, which we're going to talk about here, for why that begins to occur. But linguistically, when it starts, we can't, I can't give you a date. But what we can say is by 1350, English is won. Why? Because there's an act of parliament that says English is the language of parliament. Now, think of that phrase that I just said. English is the language of parliament. There's a paradox there, or an oxymoron almost. What's the oxymoron? Parliament is not English. Je parle. It's French. Okay? So why not call it English is the language of? What's another word for parliament? There isn't one. The meeting. We could take Shakespeare's went to the sessions of sweet silent thought. Sessions. It's the sitting of a judicial meeting, which is kind of what parliament is. Or we could go back to the Old English word for the King's Council of Advisors, the Weton. But It's Parliament. Why? It's kind of stuck. By 1350, however, English is now the official language, so to speak, of England. Okay? So, 1066, 1135. Skip up a little bit. William reigned, I said, for about 20 years. He then has a son, William Rufus, I think it is, who becomes king after him. Rufus means red-headed. Okay? He has a son. That's, I think it's his son, and a woman named Matilda. So you have Stephen and Matilda. You can go to this page and find these monarchs' names. You have Stephen and Matilda. I think, is Matilda on there? Is Stephen on there? Yeah, Stephen's mentioned on 1788. Yeah, on 1788. There's a civil war, a 20-year civil war between these two claimants to the throne. Okay? Just a little tidbit. The documents that survive from this period, or that the Anglo-Saxon chronicles that kept going up to this period, the Peterborough is the one that goes the farthest. It describes some of the things that happened during the Civil War, and the Nazis and the Soviets and the Khmer Rouge had nothing on the kinds of torture that people perpetrated against each other during this period. I mean, it's blood-curdling to read some of these accounts. So there's a civil war from 1135 to 1150 something. Henry II then becomes king. Okay? He's not the son of Henry I. He just takes the name Henry II. I had a student in my first class ask me, so Henry IV's father was Henry III? And I said, no, there is about 150 years difference between them. Who's the current king of England? It's still hard for me to say that. Charles, thank you. I was going to go, come on, guys, you got to at least know Charles is now king of England. Who is his father? He's Charles III, by the way. His father wasn't Charles II. Why? Because that guy died in 1685. His father was Prince Philip. Okay? So why did he take the name Charles? That is King Charles. Well, because he was called Prince Charles before that. Charles is his first name. He's got like 5. The last of them is Windsor. Okay? One of his names is Arthur. Why not go? Yeah, I'm going to take Arthur. Why? Because there's been no English king who's taken the name Arthur. Why? It'd be kind of a gutsy move, wouldn't it? To name yourself King Arthur with the resonance that Arthur has in English mythology. I mean, that'd be like, are you going to have Merlin show up and, you know, Excalibur, and or you bet I could, I don't know, King Jesus or something, not Jesus, Jesus, Yeshua. Just go, it'd be one step too far, so to speak. Okay? So, Henry II becomes king. Has a long reign, notice, 35 years. He's married to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Okay? Henry and his family all ultimately come from where? Normandy. Okay? Eleanor, when she marries him, her dowry of sorts, part of it is the province of Aquitaine. It's either one of, if not the largest province in France. Huge. Okay? So Henry, when he marries her, is king of England, and he becomes essentially the Duke of Aquitaine. He's already still Duke of Normandy, because that gets passed down. All right? Now, the feudal system requires what? Feudal, F-E-U-D-A-L, has nothing to do with the Old English idea of feud. I don't know how the one term is connected to the other. They're totally different. Feudal system essentially is a system of hierarchy. Who's at the top? king or queen. Who's beneath that? The next most important person. And beneath that, and you keep going down, you have dukes and barons and lords, etc., down to the people working the farm. They're the lowest of the low, all right? In the feudal system, you have vassalage. The person down below is a vassal of the person up above. That person is a vassal of the person up above, all the way up to the king. So dukes and barons are vassals to the king. See the problem that's being created? How do you have a king of one country who is the duke of property land in another country become vassal to that king? Because if you're vassal, it means you're lower than, but you're the king of a foreign country. Yeah, they had problems with it too. It's what creates, foreign wars and such. And that goes back to this period where you start to see this tension between England and France. All right? So a couple things about Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was a great patron of the arts. All right? It's roughly during this period, and not only because of her, but also because of what's going on in France, that you have the rise of the whole Arthurian romantic tradition. Chrétien de Troyes is writing in France, etc. The courtly love tradition, which I largely place under Eleanor of Aquitaine, it began earlier. I mean, she doesn't found the courtly love tradition. She injects it with steroids, essentially. She amps it up, okay? Which we're going to talk about in a moment. First, I want to talk about Thomas Becket. Why? Because if there were no Thomas Becket, we wouldn't care who Geoffrey Chaucer is. Because Geoffrey Chaucer would have never written the Canterbury Tales. Thomas Becket and Henry II were great friends. Drinking buddies, whoring buddies, the whole 9 yards. I mean, literally, went to the whorehouses together, went to the pubs together, gaming, Vegas weekend, etc. And if you want to see a great representation of this, watch the film Lion in Winter with Katharine Hepburn and Peter O'Toole. That is about their relationship. If you want to get Beckett's involvement, watch the film Becket with Richard Burton as Thomas Becket. And I can't remember who plays Henry II. Anyway, great friends. King of England, Archbishop of Canterbury position comes open. Previous Archbishop dies. It's the king's prerogative to name the Archbishop. And so, Henry wonders, who should I appoint? And then the light bulb goes off, and he decides to appoint his best friend, Thomas Becket, as Archbishop of Canterbury. He tells Becket his idea. Becket says, don't do it. Why not? I mean, Archbishop of Canterbury is the person in charge of the English church. The English church is the largest landowner in England. It gets taxes. The taxes can be funneled to the king to help the king fight his foreign battles and such. Becket says, don't do it. If I remember correctly, he flees to France. You have this is at a time when you have two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, France. It's called I still can't remember it. Avignon, like not ransom or kidnapping. There's a phrase that's escaping my memory. He flees and goes to the Pope to get advice. Pope says, you ought to do it. What better person than you, because what he told Henry was, if you name me Archbishop, I will not be Archbishop in name only. In other words, I will become the Archbishop. He says, he means, I will become what an Archbishop ought to be. I will take this deadly seriously. Full vicar of Christ kind of thing. Henry doesn't believe him. Goes and talks to the Pope. Pope says, do it. He goes back. He's made Archbishop. And seemingly immediately changes his behavior. Stops doing the drinking, stops doing the whoring, stops doing the gambling, the whole 9 yards. He becomes a true pastor, so to speak. And they immediately start knocking heads. Because Henry wants him to do certain things, collect money for his foreign battles, and Becket won't do it. Becket leaves again, goes back to France, tells the Pope, I can't keep doing this. Pope says, you can't abdicate. Bishops can't do that. They can't say, I'm tired, it's too hard, I'm going to run away. You stay in position until you die. That was the kind of the rule. Okay, he goes back. He and Henry have more battles, not physical, literal battles, contest of wills battles. And in late December 1170, anecdotally, this is what has come down. Henry II, drunk as a skunk in London, says, I think it's like December 26th, 27th, one evening, full in his cups, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? And 3 of his personal guards get on their horses and they ride to Canterbury. Takes them about a day or so. Word reaches Thomas of Becket in Canterbury, or Thomas Becket in Canterbury, they're coming. He goes to the cathedral. You can go to the site today. They've got it marked. Years and years ago when I was in Canterbury, this hideously ugly kind of modern sculpture made out of 3 swords, where the high altar used to be, okay? Because when Becket heard, he went to the high altar and he started to pray. The 3 riders get there and they just fillet him. I mean, they slaughter him to pieces. Blood everywhere. Word reaches back to Henry II. And he's like, I didn't mean it. I was drunk. Okay, remember, this guy had been his closest friend. And now he's dead. To show his contrition, Henry's, to show his contrition, I think it is a few days later, it's now January, he rides to Canterbury, and at the city walls, he dismounts, he gets down on his hands and knees, and he crawls on his hands and knees through the snow to Canterbury Cathedral. I've been at the wall, one section of the wall, and walked to Canterbury Cathedral. It's a little over a mile. So he's doing that, king. He's doing that hands and knees as a sign of penance. He didn't really want, what's his name, Thomas Becket killed. I think it's 11 years later, the Pope raises Thomas of Becket to the rank of saint. It's one of the shortest periods of beatification in the Catholic Church at that time. I mean, that's pretty quick. Because you have to go through this whole process of, have miracles been performed and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he's made a saint. From that moment on, in fact, it's even before he's made a saint, people are coming to Canterbury on pilgrimage. I mean, they've regarded him as a saint before the church regarded him as a saint. That's why we get the Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales are all about 29 pilgrims on their way, 29, 30 pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. Okay? Back to Eleanor of Aquitaine, courtly love. Courtly love tradition actually begins southern France. This is the 12th century, late in the 11th century, I think it is. 1090s, 1080s, something like that. Okay? But as I said, she amps it up. And one of the reasons is because in her, what's the phrase? Mini court, little court within the larger court, there's a monk named Andreas Capellanus. Okay? Andreas Capellanus translated a work by the 1st century Roman author Ovid. The guy who wrote the Metamorphoses about people transforming and things like that. He also wrote a book called Ars Amatoria. Okay? which was written as satire slash parody. And Ars Amatoria is all about how dirty old men can get into beautiful young women's beds. And so there's rules that he supposedly comes up with. Do this, do that, and you'll be able to have the woman of your dreams, etc., etc. He's parodying, satirizing first century Roman sexual morality, which is known for its licentiousness, its orgiastic tendencies. Caligula is a good example of this. I shouldn't tell you, but I will. Get on, no, I really shouldn't. I think it was a BBC series back in the 70s, I think it was 70s, called Caligula, about the Roman emperor. Get on YouTube. I'll warn you right now, it's like triple, quadruple X-rated. Okay, every other scene is nudity because it's portraying Caligula's Rome. In Caligula, sex with his sister and brother and whatever else. Just, that's the kind of society Ovid was ripping on. He's essentially saying, this is not good, this is not wholesome, this is not helpful. Exactly the same way, I think I mentioned in here before, when we were talking about the Germanic stuff, Old English. Tacitus writes his Germania, and describes Germanic soldiers as fighting to the death and noble and all this kind of stuff, because he's comparing them with the Romans, who he thinks are soft. And by the way, the Germanic tribes, the Romans could never defeat. They kept trying. They kept trying to expand into the Germanic territory. They couldn't get north of the Rhine River. 2 major battles that the Germans wiped out. A ton of Romans. Okay? So, he writes this book, Ovid, Ars Amatoria, gets translated as The Art of Love. Andreas Capellanus does not realize this is satire. He thinks it's a how-to book. How to get women in bed. And it's got a list of rules. I'm going to put the rules, some of them, on D2L. I'm also going to put this handout that I've got over on my lectern. Talks about the whole courtly love tradition. So, Eleanor essentially has set up, yes, Lou.
So the Andreas, okay, that's the monk?
That's the monk's name, yeah.
And he's the one that writes this.
He translates.
Oh,
He translates it.
wait, but okay, so
Ovid wrote the book, Ars Amatoria, which literally means the art of love, or the art of loving, if you want.
okay, and then Andreas thinks that it's not satire.
He doesn't think, exactly.
Okay.
He thinks this is deadly serious. If you want to be successful in love, in romance, read this book. I mean, go to any bookstore in the United States, go to the self-help section. Same kinds of books are still written today, okay? Or get on YouTube or wherever else. Shouldn't say that. So, a religion of love is essentially set up in the court. And I'm not kidding when I say a religion of love. There are rituals to love. There are priests to love. Not rituals like the orgies back in Ovid's time, but prayers and supplications to the God of love, etc. All right? Because he thinks this is real, largely. There are rules. Notice I have written, off to the side, adulteress. The courtly love tradition at its heart is centered around adultery. Why? Because Ovid said married love can't be true, passionate, romantic love. It can't be hot love. And that's because it's largely about one thing, propagating the race. It's not about the sex, it's about the children, in other words, okay? When Capellanus does this translation, they set up this religion of love. Well, the adultery thing is at the heart of it also. Why? Because it wasn't thought married love could be romantic. Because what kind of marriages within the court and those around the court do you have? Louder? Arranged. They were marriages not of convenience, not, like Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway. She got knocked up, so they had to get married, so to speak. They were marriages of power. You unite this person with this person, what do? You get those two families together, you bring those families within your fold, and you just increase your power. You unite this prince with this princess, you unite those two countries, those two nations, you increase it's all about power relationships rather than love. So marriage wasn't about love. You could go all the way up to the late 20th century. Charles and Diana was not about love. Charles and Camilla, that was about love. Long after Diana died. Why did he marry Diana? One, according to what some people say, because Mommy told him to, Queen Elizabeth. Because Diana had, so to speak, royal blood. She was connected to the line through the Spencer line, etc. And she was supposedly a virgin. So, it's adulterous at its top. So what does that mean? That means, a knight is supposed to woo his lord, his boss's wife. Okay? So what is it becoming upon her to do? Does she just immediately shoot him down because she's not interested? Nope. Why not? She might be interested. Why else? Well, you got a bunch of young studs who are wooing you, courting you, and what can you have them do? Pretty much whatever you damn well please. You, go kill this dragon. You, go fight this ogre. You, go kill this giant. You, go defeat. You. Notice 3 of those examples that I just used are all from what? Myth, fairy tale, right? Any dragons in reality? Any giants in reality? Any ogres in reality? Probably not. Okay? And that raises one of the questions. Was this real in human action? Were people really doing this in life? Or is it all, and everything written about it, entirely a fiction? And there is a group who says, entirely a fiction, and there are those who say, probably mostly a fiction, but there are some examples of people who do and did think this was kind of real. Okay? But anyways, back to courtly love. There's about 100 rules in this. So the knight woos his lady. If he wins her affection, I heard a couple of you talking about Potiphar earlier. If he wins her affection, what must they do? Besides sleep together. I mean, that's the cream on the icing on the cake, so to speak. But what else? What must they do? It's right up there at the top. You got to keep it secret. You don't go on, Oprah and start talking about your love for your Lord's wife. That also probably is an indication. If it was real, that is, if this was actually being lived out, that probably a lot of the lords, and we don't have to think, Lord, they're just being king. Like the lord of a castle has knights beneath him. Could be that kind of lord. That these guys, let it slide. They knew what was going on. But guess what? They're doing it too. That is, the lord of the castle isn't hitting up the scullery maid. He's doing what? He's doing the exact same kind of thing a knight beneath him is doing. He's punching up. The knight is reaching to a woman high above his station. The lord of that castle is also trying to reach someone higher than his station. A lady whose husband has more land or property than he does. Okay? But you got to keep it secret. And we see this, this idea of keeping that love secret, it goes up through the Renaissance period. And it influences writers like Petrarch, 13th century Italian writer, influenced Dante, etc., who creates the sonnet form, and it influences all the sonnets. John Donne is going to have a poem that we're going to read where he's going to talk, the character is going to say, let's not tell the laity of our love. The laity are the uninitiated. In other words, we have to keep our love secret. There's a little reason for that with Donne, which we'll get to when we get to Donne. But again, I'm going to put up the rules, some of the rules, etc. Okay? Courtly love is huge. Its impact is still felt today, literally, in male-female sex relations, love relations, etc. Okay? Okay, back down to here. So Henry II and Eleanor have a bunch of kids. One of whom, Richard Coeur de Lion, eldest son. What's his name mean? Richard the Lionheart. Coeur de Lion, heart of the lion. What do you know about Richard Lionheart? Just the opposite.
Oh, which one was the bad man? What's...
His little brother.
Okay, yeah, I knew one of them was.
His little brother. Richard the Lionheart is, if you know, what do you know about the Robin Hood myth? Anybody? Anything? Stole from the rich, gave to the poor, right? Who's the rich that he's stealing from? John. King John. If you ever saw the Disney Robin Hood thing, you've got, if you haven't seen it, you gotta watch it. He's called in there John the First, soon to be called John the Worst. He was the first king named John. Okay? His elder brother is Richard the Lionheart. Richard is held up kind of popular consciousness as, this great English king. Because all the Robin Hood tales portray him that way. He ruled for 10 years. Okay? 1189 to 1199. Of those 10 years, he spent 6 months in England. He didn't know a lick of English. Couldn't speak English if his life depended on it. Where did he spend the other 9 years and 6 months? Fighting the Crusades. Okay? While he was gone, little brother ruled in his stead. Little brother was not a nice guy. Raising the taxes, supposedly, part of that to acquire the amount of money that was needed to ransom Richard, who was captured, blah, blah, blah. Okay? His nickname is Lackland. What does Lackland mean? He doesn't have land. Why? Because in 1204, John lost Normandy to the King of France. So big deal. He loses a little sliver of France. Why is that important? What's Normandy? Keep going back in line. Ancestral homeland. This is like, Adam's descendants losing Eden, so to speak. I mean, this is huge. He loses the land his family came from eons back. Because, it doesn't only go back to William of Normandy, it goes back to his father and his father and his father, to when the Northmen, Vikings, first settled that part of France. We're talking hundreds of years of family ownership. He loses it. Okay? That really exacerbates things between the English and the French. 1215, he's forced to sign Magna Carta. What's Magna Carta? Anybody?
Limits Limits the power of the king.
Limits the power of the king. The Great Charter is what Magna Carta means. It's from Magna Carta that we get the foundations, largely. It does, some of it goes back to ancient Rome, but it's largely from Magna Carta that we get the foundations of the American constitutional system. Because Magna Carta guaranteed people for the first time, one, if you're arrested, you have to be charged. You couldn't just be thrown in jail and left to rot. Two, you are, or you deserve, you have a right to a trial by a jury of one's peers. Now, peer there meant something different than it means to us. Peers means of the same status. The peers of England are the lords, the dukes, the barons, the earls. And if you were a duke and you were arrested for something, you were entitled to a trial by other dukes. They would be the ones in the jury. You wouldn't pick up old poor Joe from the field and bring him into London and have him listen to the trial. It's not a peer. But if poor Joe in the field was being tried, his peers, supposedly, didn't always work out this way, would be the ones that would be listening to his trial. Magna Carta gets reissued a whole bunch of times. And I don't mean reissued, just reprinted. It gets reissued and added to. Okay? Limits the power of the king. It mandates the meetings of Parliament. And the meetings of Parliament are for a number of reasons. One of which is so that grievances can be raised to the king. You know, what's part of the First Amendment? Right of assembly and to redress, to petition for grievances to the government. Okay? That's why, you know, protests cannot be outlawed, so to speak, as long as you're peaceful. Okay? So, Magna Carta is hugely important. And then we're going to skip a whole bunch of years from 1215 to the 1300s. Because it's just a bunch more kings and a bunch of little squabbles and things like that. Not a lot of major literature from then on, or at least what is written, we no longer read anymore unless you're working on a PhD and you've got to find some dissertation topic that nobody else has ever written about before, and there's usually a reason why nobody has written about that topic before. It's not worth writing. 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France. See, the problems that began back here have just really reached ahead. All right? I didn't mention Henry III, who comes in after John, a little bit later. This guy is totally French. Okay, they're all French, right? But I mean, he's more French than the other. It's like he tries to out-French his ancestors. He brings in French bishops and the whole 9 yards. And the English, they don't like that. And there's a bit of an uprising, a bit of a struggle, okay? And, you know, the next king along kind of slows things, tamps things down. Back up to the mid-1300s. Mid-1340s, we don't have an exact date, Chaucer is born. 1340s, 1350s, late 1340s to about 1353 or so, Black Death sweeps Europe. We now know, scientists believe, that the first rats with the fleas that carried bubonic plague came from Kazakhstan. Okay? How many people died? Anybody know a percentage?
Like 66, 45?
No, not 66, roughly a third. Third of the population of Europe died. So take the United States, roughly 330 million. California's about 42 million, wipe them out. Florida's 22 million, so that brings us to 55 million, wipe them out. Texas, I think, has about 25 or 30. That brings it up to 80 something, still not enough. You'd have to add New York and Illinois to have the amount of people died in the Black Death. Where does the plague hit? Who gets affected most by it? People out in the rural areas? No, cities. Why? You got to go to Europe, okay, to understand this. Because Americans can't understand this without going to a, for lack of a better word, a real city. And I've been to New York several times. New York's not a real city in terms of like a European city. How? Why? Because New York is spread out. Even on the island of Manhattan, it does go up, but it's still spread out. Go to London and then go to New York. Go to London, go to Washington, D.C. London's got 10 million people crammed in a really small area. Okay? Back then, it didn't have 10 million people, but it had a lot of people crammed in a really small area. You could drive around. I don't suggest doing it. Walk around. You can walk around through London where there are streets literally this wide. Because they're parts of the medieval city of London. And they haven't been widened. So you have room for one car to go one direction, kind of a thing. Okay? Houses in the Middle Ages that were built on those streets, you'd have a house here, and then someone would come and buy the right and would add on to the top of that. And they would add on and hang a little bit over. And so by the time you get to the second and third story added on, the tops of the houses were close enough where you could reach out and shake the person's hand next to you on the other side of the street. So what do you do with all the refuse from your house? Dump it out into the street. Hopefully there's not somebody in the house beneath you leaning out, pulling in their laundry that's on lines going back and forth, etc. They're so closely packed, you get one and that's how the plague spread. Close contact, okay? What happens as a result? So you have all these people die who are living packed in the cities, so the cities get decimated. Well, one way of looking at that, it's very positive. Job opportunities. Because there are now still things that need to be, it's not like London is totally decimated. A lot of people still there. Those people need certain things. They need drink, both water and other kinds. They need food. They need supplies. So that creates a huge kind of sucking sound. And the sucking sound gets filled by people coming in from the provinces. To use a metaphor that's used in the film A Knight's Tale, people are given the opportunity to change their stars. They can go from being poor in serfs to being not as poor, but still mostly poor, living in the city, and now serving as barmaids, taking up a craft, becoming an apprentice in a position, things like that. It's because of the Black Death that we get a rise of the middle class. Okay? If people start being able to do a little bit more than they've been able to do for hundreds of years prior to that. We have people move from one area of the country to another area. For probably during the Anglo-Saxon period, in fact, it's said that probably up through like Shakespeare's day, most people never probably traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born in their entire lives. Well, one of the things that happens as a result of this is some people, do. They make that trek and move in, okay? 1377 and 99, I'm only going to mention them for a reason. You have Richard II, okay? Richard's important because of some reforms that he puts into place. He's also important because of what Shakespeare writes about him. Bear in mind, Shakespeare is not a historian. He's a playwright. He's writing fantasy. He's writing fiction. He's not writing history, even in the so-called history plays. But according to Shakespeare and historical sources, Richard was a narcissist. He surrounded himself with people who told him how wonderful he was. Okay? And he taxed people. He overtaxed. people. To the extent, and he treated the peasants poorly, to the extent that in 1381, a guy named Wat Tyler leads what's called the Peasants' Revolt. Okay? And he actually gets Richard to agree to meet and to have a discussion of terms to put down the Peasants' Revolt. And in 1381, the peasants, have this revolt and they have this meeting, but Richard doesn't personally show up. He has the peasants slaughtered at this meeting. You can go to the place outside London where this occurred. There's a monument in London to the peasants and the Peasants' Revolt. This event in the treatment of the peasants is not recounted, I don't want to put this, positively in the literature of the time. The vision of Piers Plowman is not the author, it's about a guy named Piers Plowman who has this vision, is this allegorical work that just shreds the government and the church at the time for hypocrisy and excess. Hypocrisy saying one thing, doing the opposite, and excess of living, excess of behavior, just excess. Okay? Chaucer also portrays some of that in some of the Canterbury Tales. But Chaucer's a lot more, what's the word I want? Tactful than the anonymous author of Piers Plowman. Because Chaucer realizes it's very easily to go just that one step too far and lose your head. Okay? I should have mentioned, when Chaucer's about 16 years old, during the 100 Years' War, he's captured in France. He's on some kind of mission for the king. We don't know what the mission was. But again, he's 16. We know it's a mission kept for the king because the king at the time, Edward III, Richard's father, pays the ransom personally for Chaucer at 16 years old. Again, something going on, not sure what. And I'm not alluding to anything sexual or anything like that. It's not that Chaucer was on some kind of spy mission. He was well educated, etc. 1350 to 1375 or so, you get what's called the alliterative revival. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a revival of the alliterative tradition. That is kind of the old English alliterative pattern, or so they thought. And it doesn't happen all over England. It happens only in the northwest section of England, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. What's clear is that whoever began this didn't know Old English. They didn't understand the rules for Old English. Here's an example of a line from Piers Plowman, which is written within this revival time period. In a fair field full of folk found I there. Okay, Old English alliterative requirements, rules, say you can have a minimum of 2 stressed syllables that alliterate and a maximum of 3. There are 4 stressed syllables in a line of poetry. But again, 3 of them may alliterate, 2 of them have to alliterate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? And this thing is several thousand lines long. Chaucer mocks this kind of poetry in the Canterbury Tales. All right? He has the pilgrim named Geoffrey Chaucer tell a tale in this kind of verse. In other words, he creates a false Geoffrey Chaucer. It's not Chaucer, the author, that is being portrayed there. He's, making up somebody. And they shut him down after not very long. The other pilgrims stop because it is so repetitive and monotonous and boring. Okay? So you have this revival. bunch of stuff written in it. The most important works are those that are found in the Cotton Nero A10 manuscript. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the Pearl poem. And that manuscript is also called, or the author of those poems is variously called either the Pearl poet or the Gawain poet. Pearl is a dream vision poem, like the Dream of the Rood, okay? About a guy whose little girl dies, and she comes to him in a vision. She's on one side of a stream, and he's on another side of the stream, and it's all religious oriented, etc. About, finding your true homeland with Jesus, etc. And then Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is totally not that. It's something different, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. 1400, Chaucer dies. 1399 to 1416, Henry IV, okay? Read Shakespeare's history plays, what's called the second tetralogy, because he writes it second, but it deals with events that occur earliest, if I'm not completely mixing those two up. Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and Henry V are the plays in that tetralogy. It's about how Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, deposes Richard II. Actually happened, real history. Richard II dies in prison. Actually happened, real history. Okay, and then Henry Bolingbroke becomes Henry IV, who's the father of Henry V, widely regarded as one of the greatest of English monarchs, well loved, etc. Read Shakespeare's play. This is that's why I'm beginning. It sets the seed for the Wars of the Roses that will come later in that century. Okay? 1453, nothing to do with England, but you need to know it. Johannes Gutenberg invents the movable printing press. Because after that point, books now become widely available. Prior to that point, if you could learn to read, it didn't do you a lot of good because you probably didn't have access to anything to read. Only thing that was available was handwritten. After 1453, literacy skyrockets. Literacy during Queen Elizabeth's day, for example, mid-16th century, like 1570s, 1580s, higher literacy rate than we have in the United States. Just let that sink in for a little bit. More people could read percentage-wise than we have in the United States who can read at age level, let's say. Okay. Lastly, 1485, Bosworth refers to a place called Bosworth Field. Up until 2012, well, still really, we're not exactly sure where Bosworth Field was. So what's so important about Bosworth Field? In Shakespeare's other history tetralogy, 4 plays about English history, in the play Richard III, the play reaches its climax in the battle between Richard III and Henry Tudor. Okay? And in that play, actual battle, Richard proclaims, Shakespeare's version, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. In other words, anybody, give me a horse and you can have my kingdom. He wants to ride away and live. Okay? But he doesn't. Richard is killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and his body is lost to history. After that battle, nobody knew what became of him, where he was buried, until 2012, I think it was. 2012, in Leicester, England, capital of Leicestershire, they're doing construction for a car park, British for a parking lot. And they know that back in the Middle Ages, there had been, I think it was a priory on this land, place where monks were. And so they're digging, they got earth mover in. And whenever anybody does any construction like this in England today, there is always an archaeologist on site. Every time. If you own, an acre of land, which most Brits don't, but if you own an acre of land and you want to put in a swimming pool, you've got to notify the local archaeologist. And every council has an archaeologist on hire. Okay? And it's because you can't dig almost anywhere in Britain without finding something. So, they discover a lead coffin. Construction stops, coffin's exhumed, it's opened. Okay, lead indicates whoever this is, high status. This is not your poor schmo. There's a body inside, or the remains of a body, a skeleton. And one thing, actually two things, are pretty clear immediately. Whoever this person was had horrible scoliosis of the spine. I mean, if the spine is supposed to be slightly like that, this guy's spine was like this. I mean, just huge curve to it. And was also found an arrow point. I think it was in the shoulder. That started to set off alarm bells. Why? Shakespeare's Richard III portrays Richard as a hunchback. And there's a reason for that. Shakespeare's playing on an old notion that hunchbacks are evil. There's just bad looking, this goes back to Plato. Bad looking on the outside, bad looking on the inside. In other words, what you see is what you get. Okay? And so if a guy's walking around like this, dragging his leg, monster, so to speak. And that's how Shakespeare portrays him. Okay? So, it takes about 2 years to do forensic analysis, DNA analysis, because there are people alive who share descendancy with Richard III's relatives at the time, known who they are. Burke's peerage goes into that kind of stuff. It's discovered this is the remains of Richard III. This is the remains of a king of England. Immediately raised a question, what do you do with it? You don't just dig another hole and shove them back in, because there's a group of people called the Ricardian Society, descendants of Richard, okay, who, immediately lay claim, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, body gets interred in a mausoleum in Leicester Cathedral. Full royal honors, the whole 9 yards, okay? So why does Shakespeare portray him the way he does? Shakespeare writes Richard III in the early 1590s. It's like 1593, 94, if I remember correctly. Who's monarch then? Queen Elizabeth. Okay? What's her last name? I almost said the current Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Elizabeth who died last September, what was her last name? It wasn't Queen. Windsor. Elizabeth Windsor. Okay? The first Queen, Elizabeth, her last name was Tudor. Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor defeated Richard III and began the Tudor dynasty. Tudor, by the way, is Welsh. Okay? He was Queen Elizabeth's grandfather. Her father was Henry VIII. His father was Henry VII. Henry Tudor, when he defeats Richard III, becomes Henry VII. Okay? Who then, line goes on, Henry VIII. Henry VIII has 3 children. Okay? Son becomes king before the 2 older sisters. When he dies, the eldest sister, half-sister, they're all half to each other, eldest sister becomes queen, she dies, and then the youngest one becomes queen, and that's Queen Elizabeth. So, she's a Tudor. Shakespeare's portraying her great-grandfather's nemesis as what? Monster. What do we have an example of? Propaganda. To the victors of war go what? The spoils. But the spoils aren't only the material goods. The spoils are what else? Big word that's used all the time today, everywhere. political context, the whole 9 yards. To the victors gets the ability to tell the narrative, to tell the story of how one became a victor. And usually, at least within the English system, it always goes back to, well, God smiled favorably upon us. Queen Elizabeth I was also called Gloriana, full of glory. You have the divine right of kings, goes back at least as far as this. Okay? Both historically and within Shakespeare's play. Richard II will talk a lot about the divine right of kings. Okay? But it goes back also in real history, the same kind of ideas. So, that's kind of, making sure I got everything. Yeah, that's kind of Middle Ages in a nutshell. We're only going to read, 3 works from the Middle Ages. L'Envol by Marie de France. I've got it written somewhere. Yep, over here. Sir Down of the Green Knight by we don't know who. Anonymous. Only one version, by the way. And Chaucer's General Prologue to the Canterbury Tales and Wife of Bath's Tale. And we're going to spend, when we get to Chaucer, we're going to spend more time on her actual tale than on her prologue. See, every one of Chaucer's tellers has a prologue. It sets up the tale. Okay? The Wife of Bath's prologue is longer than her story, which is kind of interesting. We'll talk about that for a little bit. So, L'Envol. I think I lost my place. We have 14 minutes. We're not going to cover all of it today. I'm going to overview for the most part. So, I sent an email. I didn't send an email. I posted on D2L yesterday to read L'Envol for today. Couple of things. First of all, what culture is L'Envol set in / about? What place, what group of people? What famous character from myth / history? King Arthur. It's an Arthurian tale. Okay? Let me back up for just a minute. Marie de France served in Eleanor of Aquitaine's court. Okay? She wrote what are called Breton lays. We don't really know exactly what the word lay meant back then. Probably means some kind of little song or story. Breton refers to Brittany, northern coast of France. But these are all Celtic in origin. Your introduction mentions this. If you would, for just a moment, because maybe one of you whose brains are younger and work better than mine can explain something about your introduction. Page 180. Very last sentence of the introduction to Marie de France. And this sentence is talking about L'Envol, the poem we're going to discuss in a moment, or start talking about. It, L'Envol, recounts the tale of a knight whose inherent worth is unrecognized by the Arthurian court, comma, and who, in unable to escape this uncaring and arbitrary society through the love of an otherworldly fairy figure. What the hell does that mean? Something huge is missing. I'm not sure what, but it's literally meaningless as it is. I think, and who, maybe it's supposed to mean, and who, in being unable to escape this uncaring and arbitrary society through the love of an otherworldly fairy figure, something else is then supposed to be there. Who does escape it? That's an example of really, really, really bad copy editing. I used to edit a scholarly journal. Really bad copy editing. That never... I'm going to write to the press because I've done this before a couple of their other books and they've made the corrections. But I've been using this one for I don't know how long. And I've never noticed that comment in the introduction. Anyways, back to Marie de France. De France of France. Okay? So we know, yes?
I was just going to say, you read it differently how it says it in mine.
Really?
It says, and who is able to escape.
Oh, okay. See, mine says, and who in unable.
Who
To
is
escape.
able is what I got.
Well, see, that's kind of what I assume. And who is able to escape through, see, that makes perfect sense.
Yes.
Yours probably, then, I would bet, let's see, when was this one? Mine just says copyright 2017. It doesn't have a printing date. So yours might have been printed later than mine. But that, I'm glad to know that, because then I don't have to write them.
Reprinted with corrections in 2019.
There you go. So Marie de France, we've got two of her lays. The first one, Bisclavret, or you can pronounce it Bisclavret in American English if you want, about a werewolf. It's one of the earliest stories about a werewolf. It's a pretty cool story, by the way. And then L'Envol. L'Envol, this version is the source of a Middle English tale called Sir Launfal. I think your introduction mentions that. I'm not positive. I looked at it this morning, but I'm drawing a blank. Written by a guy named Sir Thomas Leicester. His name means Thomas of Chester, the town Chester. Okay? And in that version's very similar. It's largely the same. But a couple of things that go on in this poem. Well, let me go back to another question I was going to ask. So it's Arthurian, right? What's the basic plot? Big picture, not details. What happens? Who's L'Envol? He's a knight. He's the son of a king. He's the son of a foreign king. He's at Camelot. We're not told why. How's he treated? Poorly. He's like an outcast. Here, Arthur's giving out goodies to everybody. L'Envol doesn't get any. Okay? So, what does he do? Does he go moan and complain to Arthur? I want what's mine, play the victim card? No. What's he do? He gets on his horse and he rides out to a meadow. More specifically, he rides out to a meadow where there's a tree and there's a brook. Okay? Don't do that. In medieval literature, if you're a single knight, and I don't mean single unmarried, I mean a solitary knight, you don't go out to a meadow where there's a brook and a tree and fall asleep. Why? Vast majority of time, you're going to get kidnapped by the fairies. That's a formula. What happens? He wakes up, and what does he see? Two beautiful women coming towards him, and they say, our mistress wants to speak to you. He's like, cool. There's a pavilion suddenly out of nowhere. What does his mistress want with him? What does their mistress want with him? Don't be shy. I've seen a couple faces go, well, it's pretty clear what she wants. What does she offer him? Let me put it that way. Herself. And anything else he wants. Right? She says, you can have me. And she's described in very sensual terms. Sometimes it's translated as wearing see-through clothing. A shift, in other words. But she offers him her body and whatever else he wants. Because not only will he get her body, does he have to worry about money anymore? No. He has untold wealth. Okay? What's the flip side of the agreement? Just like, Lord Thane relationship. So she's given her part of the bargain. Got to keep it a secret. He's like, no problem there. Until I walked in, and a couple of you over here were talking about, I think, about Guinevere and its relation to the story of Guinevere and L'Envol and its relation to what story? Potiphar in the Old Testament. Joseph and Potiphar's wife in Genesis. What's that story?
Joseph gets sold into slavery in Egypt, and then he gets sold to Potiphar, and then Potiphar's wife likes him, and she makes a move on him, and he's like, know, and then she says that, oh, he tried to rape me, and then they throw him in prison.
He escapes from her clutches, and she grabs onto his robe, and he runs off naked. She goes, look, here's my proof. And he gets thrown into prison, and we get Joseph Prince of Dreams, Spielberg or whoever did the film, that version. Okay? So, a woman accuses the man of trying to rape her. He's innocent. So what's Guinevere do? Does she immediately go to that extent? No, she doesn't. What does Lonval do? Not interested. What does she say when he says he's not interested? What's her next point of attack? Yeah. Oh, that's right, because I've heard you don't go that way. You like the boys, don't you? And he's like, get out of here. That's what causes him to do what?
My girl's better than you.
He says, the lowest scullery maid of my mistress's palace is better than you. Okay, who's he talking to? The queen. What's her name? Guinevere. What popular consciousness? What do you know / think about Guinevere? She's supposed to be pretty hot. There's supposed to be a lot going for her. I mean, Lancelot and Guinevere, Arthur and Guinevere. Guess what? A lot of other tales from Middle English. I can't say Galahad. Bors and Guinevere, Bedivere and Guinevere, Fred and Guinevere, George and, in other words, Guinevere gets around. In a lot of other medieval literature, she's portrayed pretty much as a tramp. Okay? I don't mean a prostitute. A prostitute prostitution is an exchange of goods and services. You give me money, I'll give you a service. She gives it out freely. She's a slut in modern terms. Okay? Pretty strong, I know. Here's another poem. Arthurian poem. And this one's hilarious. Arthur and his knights are sitting around one night, around the round table, and they're drinking. And a horn is brought in, a drinking horn, okay? And the horn has a spell around it. If you say something false, the water, the liquid inside, the beer will spill, okay? And so the challenge is to say something about your lover, about your mistress, your girlfriend, your wife, etc. Or if it's entirely within the courtly love tradition, it's your adulterous lover. But it's not that, because Arthur's going to talk about Guinevere. So it goes around to people, and some guy says, oh, my wife, or girlfriend, whatever, she would never cheat on me, and it, dribbles a little, kind of indicating, yeah, well, she was false that one time. Finally comes around to Arthur. He starts to talk about Guinevere, and it's like a fire hose. I mean, the horn just starts spitting booze out. He doesn't even get it close to his mouth, and it's spitting, indicating Guinevere's known around these parts, so to speak. Okay? So, why is Lonval in the position he's in the first place? I mean, one of the questions to ask is, why is Lonval so poorly treated by Arthur? What does this tell us about Camelot? Camelot's not everything it's cracked up to be. Camelot, the model of chivalry, the model of virtue. If Lonval, who is the son of a king, is not treated properly, then that says, there are some cracks in this society. And what do we see happen? Those cracks get widened. How so? Guinevere, she widens those cracks. Notice, when you get to that part of the story, and again, we'll talk about it on Thursday. By the way, start Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, because we're not going to spend long. I'm going to skip a lot of it to get to the end, which is the important point. Because it's all about behavior. Ultimately, this poem, this story, is all about not proper moral, proper knightly, proper courtly behavior. I've talked about courtly love. I haven't talked about chivalry. at all. We're going to talk about chivalry Thursday, okay? But look at the story and notice who comes to Lonval's defense. And I don't mean the fairy queen. By the way, his lover, she's the queen of fairy. She's not just some average, ordinary dime store fairy, all right? She's the queen of the fairies. Pretty clear. But who comes to Lonval's defense? There's a reason we read these things in the order that we do. Sir Gawain, okay? It says something about his character. Okay, we'll stop there a minute early. I'll put this document and the rules of courtly love on D2L. I think you'll find them, if you take a look at them, interesting. Don't forget the exam due tomorrow night. Those that have already been done, up until yesterday afternoon, I've graded. I think you should be able to see how you did.